In the heart of 1930s America, a new kind of outlaw was rising. A man whose name alone could make people lock their doors and newspapers scream in panic. Machine Gun Kelly. A gangster with a Tommy gun in his hands, and a reputation far bigger than the crimes he actually committed. But who was he really? A fearsome criminal? Or a legend built by newspapers, rumors, and one very ambitious woman? This is the true story of Machine Gun Kelly, the gangster America feared, and the man behind the myth. In the early decades of the 20th century, Memphis, Tennessee, sat on the banks of the Mississippi River like a city with two souls. One side glittered with streetcars, respectable families, elegant homes, and the steady rhythm of trade moving up and down the river. The other side was a maze of smoky back rooms, cheap saloons, whisper deals, and restless young men looking for an easier path than honest work. It was in this divided world that George Kelly Barnes was born on July 18, 1895, a child whose life would one day be twisted into legend. At first glance, nothing about his childhood suggested the future that awaited him. He came from a stable home. His father, George Sr., believed in routine, discipline, and the dignity of labor. His mother, Mary, gentle and religious, saw her son's charm and believed he could grow into something respectable. They lived comfortably enough, attending church on Sundays, sending George to school in clean shirts and polished shoes. He played baseball in the streets, helped his mother with chores, and seemed destined for a perfectly ordinary life. But George was not made for ordinary things. Even as a boy, he carried a restlessness he couldn't explain. Teachers said he was bright but distracted, always staring out windows or doodling instead of listening. He wasn't rebellious in a loud way. He simply couldn't sit still inside the boundaries expected of him. When other boys spoke of becoming lawyers or businessmen, George dreamed of adventure. Dangerous men, daring escapes, stories of outlaws and soldiers who lived on their own terms. As he grew older, boredom became his first enemy. Memphis was full of temptations for a young man craving excitement. Down by the river, he found the kinds of people who would influence him more than school teachers or preachers ever could. Sailors passing through, drifters with crooked smiles, men who whispered about quick money and questionable jobs. George watched them closely. He listened to stories of crime, smuggling, bootlegging, and the hidden world beneath the respectable city. Nothing in those stories frightened him. If anything, they fascinated him. His first steps into crime were small and almost innocent. He stole gasoline, sold illegal liquor, took part in petty thefts. He didn't have the ruthlessness or the ambition of a true criminal yet, just a curiosity and a desire to belong to something thrilling. Even when he married his first wife, Geneva Ramsey, and tried to settle into normal work at a lumber company, the routine suffocated him. Honest life offered security, but not excitement, not identity. And George craved identity most of all. Then Prohibition arrived in 1920, turning alcohol into a legal treasure and ordinary men into criminals overnight. America had created a vast underground market, and George walked right into it. Bootlegging suited him. Fast money, dangerous drives, late-night deals. It was messy, unpredictable, and always risky, but he loved it. Still, he was no crime lord. He was a small-time operator. He got caught more than he should have. By his mid-20s, George had been arrested several times, usually for minor liquor violations. The police didn't fear him. Fellow criminals didn't respect him. In truth, he was more clumsy than dangerous. There was no sign yet of the mythic figure he would later become. No machine gun, no terror, no nationwide fear. He was still just George Barnes, an ordinary man dabbling in crime. His turning point came when he was sent to Leavenworth Penitentiary, one of the toughest prisons in the country. Inside its concrete walls, he was surrounded by criminals far more experienced than he was. Men who ran multi-state operations, men who had robbed banks, hijacked trains, or killed to get what they wanted. Compared to them, George was amateurish, soft, harmless. But prison became an unexpected kind of education. George listened more than he spoke. He learned how professional criminals talked, dressed, carried themselves. He observed the ones who commanded respect with nothing more than their presence. In this rough environment, George began shaping a persona, a mask of toughness. He learned to walk with confidence, to speak calmly under pressure, to project strength even when he didn't feel it. Prison didn't turn him into a violent man, but it taught him how to act like one. When he finished his sentence and stepped back into the free world, he was still searching for an identity, still unsure of who he was or who he wanted to be. He drifted through jobs, through cities, through opportunities. And then destiny placed someone in his path who would change everything. A woman named Kathryn. Kathryn Thorne was unlike anyone George had ever known. Sharp, ambitious, manipulative, and already deeply comfortable with crime. She wasn't content with small-time scams or petty theft. She wanted something bigger, a place in the world of legends. She saw potential in George, but not for who he was, rather for who he could be molded into. She recognized immediately the thing George had been searching for since childhood, an identity powerful enough to shape the world around him. Kathryn became the architect of his transformation. She crafted his appearance, encouraged a tougher attitude, bought him new clothes, reshaped his posture, polished his rough edges, and fed his ego with visions of being feared and admired. But her boldest move was the nickname. It didn't come from George himself. It came from Kathryn, who understood the power of names better than any criminal of her time. She handed him a Thompson submachine gun, more a prop than a tool, and told him, "This is who you are now, Machine Gun Kelly." It was perfect. It was dangerous. It was unforgettable. And suddenly, George Barnes wasn't just a small-time bootlegger. He was a brand. Kathryn spread the name through criminal circles, whispered it to the right people, and even encouraged newspapers to pick it up when George got into trouble. She wanted a husband who was more myth than man, and George, eager to be someone at last, embraced the persona fully. He practiced holding the gun, posing with it, moving with the swagger of a hardened outlaw. People believed the image because they wanted to. America during the Great Depression was hungry for legends, heroes, and villains both. Machine Gun Kelly fit the role perfectly. No insults. Yet beneath the surface, he still wasn't the violent criminal people imagined. He had the name, the gun, the reputation, but he didn't yet have the crime big enough to justify them. He was an actor playing a role written largely by his ambitious wife. But time was closing in. The world was changing. Crime was becoming more organized, law enforcement more aggressive, the FBI more determined, and George, with his new identity and dangerous reputation, was drifting toward a moment that would define him forever. A crime that would push him out of the shadows and into the center of national attention. The kidnapping that would make the name Machine Gun Kelly echo across the country. Before newspapers feared him, before the FBI hunted him, before the myth grew larger than the man himself, he was just George Barnes, a restless boy from Memphis searching for something more. And in that search, he stepped into a role he could never escape. His transformation had begun. The legend was being written. And the real story was only just starting. 1. When the 1930s arrived, America was a country caught in a deep, aching silence. The Great Depression had crushed businesses, darkened homes, and stolen hope from millions. Banks collapsed, families starved. Entire towns seemed to sag under the weight of despair. And in that kind of world, people looked for something, anything, that could distract them from the emptiness of their own lives. Some turned to heroes, others turned to villains. And the newspapers, hungry for stories that could be sold for pennies, devoured every rumor of crime and danger they could find. Machine Gun Kelly was stepping into the perfect storm. By now, George had fully embraced the identity Kathryn had created for him. He wore crisp suits, carried himself with confidence, and leaned into the persona of a dangerous outlaw. The truth behind closed doors was more complicated. He was still a man who sometimes hesitated, still unsure if he was capable of the image he projected. But Kathryn never let him slip back into doubt. She repeated the same lines again and again, that he was destined for greatness, that he should be feared, that the world needed to know his name. She pushed him forward with a mixture of ambition, manipulation, and something that almost resembled twisted encouragement. They traveled from city to city, dipping into various illegal operations, small robberies, bootlegging deals, stolen cars. Kathryn promoted him to everyone they met, inflating his accomplishments, calling him Machine Gun Kelly, as if it were a title he had earned on battlefields instead of in whispers. She told people he was dangerous, unpredictable, ruthless. She told the stories of gunfights that never happened, escapes that were never needed, crimes he had nothing to do with. Kathryn didn't just build a legend, she advertised it. The criminal underworld began to take notice. The nickname spread slowly at first, then quickly, bouncing from one city to another like a rumor set on fire. People who didn't know him claimed they did. Men whispered that he carried a Thompson gun everywhere, Women bragged that they'd seen him stare down entire groups of armed police without blinking. Even other outlaws, who should have known better, began to believe the legend. They took Kathryn's stories as fact because the country was ready to believe in larger-than-life criminals. Yet there was still one problem. George had yet to commit a crime worthy of the name he carried. His reputation was outgrowing him too fast, like clothes several sizes too big. Kathryn knew it. The underworld knew it. And somewhere deep down, George knew it too. He needed something bigger, something dramatic, something that would force the country to see him not just as a nickname, but as a real threat. That something appeared in the form of an idea Kathryn couldn't resist: kidnapping. Kidnapping had become the ultimate crime of the era. The rewards were enormous, and the risks, while high, were manageable for those who planned carefully. Several gangs had succeeded in ransoming wealthy businessmen and turning instant profits. Newspapers covered every detail, turning criminals into dark celebrities overnight. Kathryn understood immediately that if Machine Gun Kelly wanted to become a legend, this was the way. The target was chosen with a cold, calculated logic. His name was Charles F. Urschel, a wealthy oilman from Oklahoma City, successful, influential, and well-connected. His family was known for its money, which made him valuable. His daily routine was predictable, which made him vulnerable. And most importantly, Urschel was respected enough that his kidnapping would trigger national panic and immediate headlines. Kathryn, ever the strategist, began studying Urschel's life. She gathered information, listened to rumors, observed patterns. George watched her work with a strange mixture of admiration and unease. She had a mind fitted for danger, sharper and braver than his. He sometimes wondered if Kathryn was the real criminal and he was just her chosen instrument. Planning the kidnapping took weeks. George teamed up with a man named Albert Bates, an experienced criminal who brought professional discipline to the operation. Bates was calm where George was nervous, methodical where George was impulsive. Kathryn liked Bates' reliability. George liked the way Bates made him look more competent. Together, the three of them crafted a plan that felt clean and foolproof on paper. They would strike at night. They would move quickly. They would blindfold Urschel before he could study their faces. They would hide him on a remote farm, quiet, isolated, impossible to trace. They would demand $200,000, a sum unheard of during the Depression. If successful, they would gain more than money. They would gain notoriety. The newspapers would explode with the story. Machine Gun Kelly would finally be the outlaw Kathryn had spent years shaping. Of course, plans on paper always differ from reality. On July 22, 1933, George, Bates, and Kathryn approached the Urschel home. The night was humid, the kind of warmth that sticks to your skin and makes the air feel thick. Urschel was playing cards with friends, a harmless evening of leisure. Moments later, the peace shattered. The men burst into the house with guns drawn, tense and shaky, adrenaline surging through their veins. Several people were present. The plan had been clean, but the execution became messy. In the confusion, George and Bates forced two men into their car, Charles Urschel and another guest who had happened to be standing close by. George cursed under his breath. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They needed Urschel, not two potential witnesses. But the moment for fine decision-making had passed. The car sped off into the night with both men inside. Once they had driven far enough, the kidnappers demanded the men identify themselves. The moment Urschel confirmed who he was, Bates released the other man without hesitation. He was harmless. They had what they came for. But this small error, this tiny deviation from the plan, planted the first seed of future disaster. Because the second man, now free, became an immediate and reliable witness, offering descriptions and details to the authorities that would help shape the investigation later. Urschel, meanwhile, remained calm in a way that unnerved George. Most men cried, begged, or demanded answers. Urschel did none of that. Blindfolded, forced into unknown locations, threatened with guns, yet he stayed composed. He listened. He paid attention. He counted footsteps, memorized sounds, took in every detail of the environment. Even while tied to a chair at the remote farm where he was held, he remained alert. His mind worked like a machine. George didn't notice. Bates didn't notice. Kathryn didn't notice. But the FBI would notice later. Days passed. Urschel's wife received the ransom demand of $200,000. During the Great Depression, it was a staggering sum, equal to millions today. Yet she was determined to save her husband and agreed without hesitation. The exchange was arranged. The money changed hands. George and Bates got what they wanted. Most kidnappers, after receiving ransom, immediately released their prisoner. But Kathryn insisted on keeping Urschel a little longer, fearing he might lead police back to them. It was a risky decision. The longer you hold a hostage, the higher the chance of mistakes. And indeed, mistakes were made. Little ones, but enough to give the FBI a trail. On July 30th, after more than a week in captivity, Urschel was released, alive, unharmed, but carrying inside him a clear picture of where he had been. His memory, precise and selective, became the FBI's most valuable weapon. He reported the sounds he heard: airplanes overhead at certain hours, the distant hum of machinery, footsteps across wooden floors, the pattern of the cicadas outside, even the smell of the fields at different times of day. The FBI pieced together the clues and followed the trail to a farmhouse in Paradise, Texas, owned by Kathryn's family. The net tightened, and suddenly the illusion of safety George and Kathryn had built began to crumble. The FBI was relentless. They dug into the past, tracked associates, questioned neighbors, and identified conspirators. The once untraceable operation was now collapsing under careful investigation. George and Kathryn fled from city to city, but the escape was shaky. They were used to running from police before, but this was different. This was federal law enforcement, and the FBI had been given a direct order from Director J. Edgar Hoover, Find Machine Gun Kelly. For the first time, George felt the weight of the persona Kathryn had created for him. Being feared was thrilling when it came from criminals and newspapers, but being hunted by the federal government was something else entirely. He realized the legend he'd embraced was now closing in around him. They were finally tracked to Memphis, the city of George's childhood, as if fate wanted to bring him home one last time before the end of the story. On the morning of September 26, 1933, FBI agents surrounded the house where George and Kathryn were hiding. The couple woke to shouts, to the sound of boots, to the unmistakable presence of armed men outside every exit. George panicked. Kathryn panicked. The legend crumbled instantly. The story spread that as agents stormed the house, George dropped his gun and shouted the words that would follow him forever. "Don't shoot, G-men." Whether he truly said it or not remains debated, but it didn't matter. The newspapers loved it. It made a perfect ending for the myth they had helped build. In an instant, Machine Gun Kelly was transformed from a dangerous outlaw into the man whose surrender gave America a new nickname for its federal agents. George did not resist. Kathryn did not resist. The couple who had once fantasized about power and notoriety were arrested without firing a single shot. Their kidnapping of Charles Urschel would become one of the most famous crimes in American history, not because of its violence, but because of the strange clash between myth and reality it exposed. Machine Gun Kelly, the legend, had been feared across the country. But the man behind the name surrendered in minutes, overwhelmed, defeated, and lost inside the persona he had never fully grown into. His trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. His reputation, once built to make him feared, now made jurors eager to judge him harshly. Newspapers covered every moment with feverish energy, painting him as both villain and celebrity. Kathryn faced her own charges, her influence undeniable in the crime's orchestration. And as George sat in his cell awaiting sentencing, the persona of Machine Gun Kelly hovered around him like a shadow he could no longer control. He felt the weight of it, powerful at first, then terrifying. The name had lifted him into legend, but it was also the name that had destroyed him. Prison awaited him again, but this time it would not be temporary. This time he would be locked away for life, not as George Barnes, the restless boy from Memphis, but as Machine Gun Kelly, the outlaw America had chosen to fear. And still, he could not escape the truth buried beneath all the layers of myth. He had never truly been the monster people imagined, just an ordinary man caught in the storm of a legend he helped create, but could never control. The summer heat in Oklahoma City felt heavy, but the tension inside the Kelly home was heavier. George Machine Gun Kelly paced back and forth, rubbing his palms together the way he always did when his nerves outgrew his confidence. Kathryn sat at the table watching him with that sharp, calculating look she used whenever she felt he needed to be pushed. She knew he wasn't the monster people whispered about. She also knew she needed him to become something close to it, at least on the outside, if they were ever going to rise above petty bootlegging and make real money. She slid a newspaper toward him, On the front page, headlines screamed about the rising wave of kidnappings across the country. Big money, big fear, and criminals becoming famous overnight. Kathryn tapped the paper with one perfectly manicured finger. "This," she said calmly, "is where the real opportunity is." George looked away, uneasy. "Kidnapping? Kathryn, that's different. This isn't like running liquor or holding up a small bank. This is serious federal trouble." "Everything worth having is serious," she replied coldly. Kathryn had been thinking about this idea for months. They needed something dramatic, something bold enough to break them out of the small-time life. The more the newspapers exaggerated George's gangster image, the more she believed they had to live up to it. And nothing built a legend faster than taking someone rich, powerful, and important and making the entire country watch. She had already found the perfect target. Charles Urschel. Oil money. Politically connected. The kind of man whose disappearance would send shockwaves across the nation. The reward, she believed, would be easy ransom and automatic entry into gangster history. But convincing George meant first convincing his ego, then overpowering his fear. She played the role of strategist, architect, motivator, and manipulator all at once. "They already say you're dangerous," she whispered. "They already fear you. You just have to step into the role." George swallowed hard. The truth was, he didn't enjoy violence. He liked speed, money, and excitement, but real danger made him sweat. Yet every time he thought about saying no, he imagined Kathryn's face, the disappointment, the frustration, the belief that she could have married someone more daring. He wanted to prove something to her, even if he didn't fully understand why. Kathryn continued. "Urschel is predictable. He plays bridge almost every night at the same house. He's surrounded by friends, but friends don't matter when a man with a machine gun walks in." She tapped George's shoulder. "Or when the man the newspapers call Machine Gun Kelly walks in." The plan began forming in the dim lights of the kitchen. Their partner, Albert Bates, joined them. Older, clever, calm under pressure. Bates wasn't scared like Kelly was. If anything, he seemed excited by the challenge. He had robbed banks with machine-like precision, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence George envied. Bates listened to Kathryn lay out the strategy and nodded. "It's risky," he said finally, "but it'll work. He's valuable enough to guarantee ransom." Kathryn smiled, feeling victory close. George felt the weight of inevitability fall on him. The plan wasn't just Kathryn's idea anymore. It was happening. In the nights leading up to the kidnapping, the three of them drove past the wealthy neighborhood where Urschel spent evenings with his friends. Kathryn watched from the back seat, memorizing the routine. She kept notes of who came and went, who stood outside, where the cars were parked. Every detail mattered. They couldn't afford mistakes. George sat silently many of those nights, gripping the steering wheel too tightly, imagining everything that could go wrong. Federal agents, alarms, gunfire. He didn't want to kill anyone. Kathryn told him he wouldn't have to, that the gun was just for show. People obey fear, she reminded him. They obey reputation. They prepared a quiet farmhouse in Paradise, Texas, for the captive. It was isolated, surrounded by thick fields and dusty roads that no police patrols would casually drive down. George practiced giving orders in a deep voice. Kathryn taught him how to stand, how to glare, how to hold the Tommy gun so it looked natural and intimidating. He hated how unnatural it felt, like he was wearing a costume too big for him. But he kept practicing. On July 22nd, 1933, the night came. The neighborhood was calm, peaceful, glowing softly under the porch lights. Cars lined the driveway of the mansion, where Urschel and his friends played cards. From the outside, it looked like nothing could go wrong in a place like this. Inside the car, George's hand trembled. Kathryn put her hand over his. "It's just acting," she whispered. "Be the man they think you are." Bates checked his weapon, nodded once, and they stepped out of the car. The front door opened suddenly, and the two men rushed inside. The room froze. Guests stared at them, confused at first, then horrified as the machine gun came into view. George shouted commands the way he had practiced, loud, aggressive, pretending he wasn't terrified. Two men in the room looked like Urschel, same build, same age. George panicked for a moment. Which one was the right one? Bates made the decision quickly, grabbing both. Better to take two than make a mistake. They forced the men into the car while the others stood paralyzed in fear. George could hear his heart pounding louder than the engine. Kathryn waited a few miles away at a rendezvous point. When they arrived with the captives, she didn't waste a moment on fear or hesitation. She drove like she was carrying nothing more dangerous than grocery bags, not two blindfolded millionaires. Urschel, despite the blindfold and the uncertainty, stayed surprisingly calm. He listened carefully to every engine sound, every turn, every shift in the car. He counted steps, felt the ground under his feet, memorized voices. He understood immediately that being observant might be the only power he had left. When they reached the farmhouse, Urschel's intelligence became even more dangerous for the kidnappers. He memorized patterns, the smell of the fields, the number of people nearby, the sound of trains far in the distance. While George tried to play the role of the terrifying kidnapper, Urschel quietly turned himself into a human recording device. The kidnappers kept him blindfolded, guarded, and constantly watched. Kathryn wrote the ransom letter with precise, threatening language. She knew the FBI was getting better at tracking criminals, so she wanted the letter to sound professional, confident, almost businesslike. They demanded $200,000, a staggering sum in the 1930s. Enough to change their lives forever. Meanwhile, George grew increasingly anxious. Every radio broadcast about the kidnapping made him jump. Every sound outside the farmhouse made him reach for his gun. Kathryn grew more focused, more determined. Bates stayed calm. No und. Urschel never fought back, never begged, never panicked. But he remembered everything. He left fingerprints everywhere on purpose, thinking it might help investigators confirm he was alive and narrow down where he had been held. In those tense days, the dynamic between George and Kathryn became even clearer. George was the face of the fear. Kathryn was the brain behind it. And Bates was the steady hand keeping the operation from falling apart. When the ransom was finally paid, the kidnappers waited for confirmation before releasing Urschel. They dropped him off far from the farmhouse, blindfolded, and drove away quickly. They didn't know how much he had observed. They didn't know how dangerous his memory would become. Neat. But the moment the ransom exchanged hands, the FBI began the largest kidnapping investigation in the country's history. And every detail Urschel remembered brought them one step closer to the people who took him. As George counted the money, trying to calm his nerves, Kathryn felt triumphant. She believed they had just made themselves legendary. What she didn't know was that Urschel's mind had been working the entire time, and it would soon become the greatest weapon against them. The moment Charles Urschel was released, blindfold removed, and breath taken freely under the open sky, he didn't waste a second. He asked for a telephone, insisted on speaking to federal authorities, and calmly provided details with a precision that stunned everyone who heard him. He had been quiet during captivity, polite, cooperative, but in reality, he had been building the strongest case the FBI had ever seen from a kidnapping victim. He described the number of times he had been moved, the temperature shifts, the direction the wind blew, the sound of airplanes overhead at specific times, the exact moments when trains passed, the smell of livestock, the pattern of footsteps outside the door. Even the type of insects he heard, something no ordinary man would listen for. What Kelly didn't know was that Urschel had lived his entire life in business, where attention to detail meant survival. And during his captivity, fear sharpened his senses. The FBI used his descriptions to triangulate the location. Soon, a map on the table in Washington had marks circling a small region near Paradise, Texas. Agents were mobilized. While the FBI prepared to move, George Machine Gun Kelly sat inside a hotel room with his share of the ransom, hands trembling every time a car engine passed outside. Money was supposed to bring freedom, but all he could feel now was the weight of eyes watching from the dark. Kathryn tried to keep him calm, but even she wasn't immune to the rising tension. She sensed something moving in the air, something bigger than before. The couple bounced from city to city, trying to stay ahead of suspicion. They hid in Memphis, then in small motels across the South, carrying stacks of cash wrapped tightly in bags. Kathryn kept telling George to relax, reminding him that no one could tie them to the farmhouse. But even she underestimated Urschel's mind. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse, FBI agents arrived quietly, surrounding the property before dawn. They found the place almost exactly as Urschel had described: wooden floors, the smell of animals, a dusty yard. Inside, they found fingerprints, footprints, traces of forced captivity. Every piece matched Urschel's account. The agents soon connected names. Kathryn's relatives had been living there. Bates had been seen nearby. And George Kelly, whose reputation had been blown up by newspapers, was suddenly the prime suspect. The machine gun myth came back to haunt him. Whether he had used the gun or not didn't matter. The public image he had built now worked against him. A warrant was issued. A manhunt began. Across the country, posters went up with Kelly's face. Detectives interviewed bootleggers, bartenders, taxi drivers. Rumors spread. Some said he had fled to Canada. Others said he was hiding in the South. But quietly, the FBI was closing in on Memphis. Inside a rented home in the city, George grew more desperate by the day. He checked out the windows constantly, jumping at shadows. Kathryn told him to calm down, but even she started sleeping with her clothes on, ready to run. She hated the idea of being hunted. She had always seen herself as the mastermind, not the fugitive. Then came the night when everything fell apart. A neighbor noticed something strange. Unfamiliar cars coming and going late at night, lights turning on and off too quickly, nervous behavior. He tipped off the authorities. Within hours, FBI agents and local police surrounded the Kelly hideout quietly, waiting for dawn to break. Inside, George sensed something was wrong before the first shout came. A dog barked outside, then another, then boots on gravel. Before he could react, a booming voice echoed across the yard. "Come out with your hands up." George froze. The fear he had tried to suppress for weeks hit him full force. Kathryn grabbed his arm and hissed, "Don't you dare panic." But he couldn't move. His legs felt weak. His breath came out in shaky bursts. Agents yelled again, "This is the FBI. Come out now." George turned pale. The legend the newspapers built didn't live here. Not in this shaking man who clung to the wall like it might swallow him. Kathryn realized in that moment that the act was over. The image she created couldn't save them anymore. The famous line that would follow him for the rest of his life came out in a broken, trembling voice. "Don't shoot, G-men. Don't shoot." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't bravery. It was surrender. Total, absolute surrender. The door opened slowly. George stepped out with his hands trembling above his head. Kathryn followed, her face tight with fury, disappointment, and something close to disbelief. The FBI closed in, cuffing them swiftly. Inside the house, they found money from the ransom stuffed into bags and drawers, enough evidence to bury them. As agents drove the couple away, crowds gathered on the sidewalks, whispering, pointing, staring. The great machine gun Kelly, the man who terrified America, the man newspapers painted as ruthless, was sitting quietly in the back seat, eyes empty, shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the monster people imagined. For the first time, Kathryn saw a truth she had refused to admit. George had never been the gangster she had wanted him to be. He had only worn the costume, and the moment real consequences stood at the door, it fell apart. But the story wasn't over. The trial was coming. Public, dramatic, historic. The government wanted to make an example out of them. And the legend of Machine Gun Kelly would reach its defining moment in a courtroom where fear, guilt, and myth would collide. The courtroom was packed. not just with lawyers and jurors, but with reporters, photographers, and curious citizens. America had been following the story for months. The headlines had built Machine Gun Kelly into a myth, a terrifying outlaw with a machine gun, capable of anything. Now the country was about to see the man behind the name. George Machine Gun Kelly sat at the defendant's table, hands folded, his face pale but composed. Kathryn sat beside him, sharp and defiant, though even her confidence seemed slightly frayed. The ransom money, the planning, the flight, all of it had brought them here. The newspapers chronicled every detail, every gesture, every whispered conversation. The legend was being scrutinized under fluorescent lights. The prosecution presented their case with meticulous precision. They recounted the kidnapping of Charles Urschel, the ransom demand, the flight across states, and the evidence that tied the couple to the crime. They played audio of witnesses, showed maps of the farmhouse, and displayed the money recovered. Every detail was meant to paint Kelly as the ruthless mastermind the public imagined. But something curious emerged. Despite the careful presentation, George's personality contradicted the myth. He wasn't wild-eyed or threatening. He was nervous, polite, occasionally quiet. The reporters noticed it. The jurors noticed it. Even the FBI agents noted how human he seemed in contrast to the headlines. Kathryn tried to control the narrative. She insisted that George had been fearless, that he was the leader, that the nickname wasn't just for show. She emphasized the machine gun, the planning, the boldness. Yet witnesses testified to his hesitation, to moments where he appeared unsure, where he relied on Bates or her direction. Slowly, the public perception began to shift. Maybe the man who terrified America was in fact more myth than monster. Charles Urschel himself took the stand. Calm, collected, precise, he recounted the days he spent in captivity. His voice was steady, his observations sharp. He described George as competent enough to follow orders, but not violent. He spoke of Kathryn as the controlling force, the one who shaped the events with cunning and determination. Every word chipped away at the legend, revealing George as a man caught between fear, ambition, and the manipulations of those around him. The defense tried to argue for mitigation. George had never killed anyone. He had never truly threatened harm beyond what was necessary. He had cooperated at every stage. They painted him as a man swept up in forces larger than himself, a figure pushed into legend by circumstance and ambition rather than innate violence. But in 1930s America, the headlines and the public demand for justice were insistent. The country wanted a villain. The FBI wanted a conviction to demonstrate the reach of federal law. The myth, once created, could not be ignored. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty on all counts of kidnapping, Machine Gun Kelly and Kathryn Kelly were sentenced to life in federal prison. George's surrender, the phrase, "Don't shoot, G-men," had already immortalized him in the public imagination. Now the sentence ensured that the legend would endure, even if the reality had been far less fearsome than people imagined. George's life in prison was quiet compared to the chaos that had defined his free years. He spent time reflecting, reading, and enduring the routines of confinement. The myth followed him. Guards and fellow inmates knew him by the nickname that had terrified the nation. Visitors and reporters occasionally came, seeking interviews, photographs, or confirmation that the man behind the legend was truly as formidable as history remembered. George remained calm, polite, distant, carrying himself not as the terrifying Machine Gun Kelly, but as a man who had survived the storm of his own creation. Kathryn, meanwhile, faced a separate sentence, her influence and cunning recognized as equal to the crime itself. The dynamic between them, the architect and the actor, had played out in the public eye. History would remember both, but for different reasons. One as the mastermind, the other as the face of fear. Over time, the name Machine Gun Kelly took on a life independent of the man. It appeared in books, magazines, and eventually films. Children learned of the outlaw in school. Adults recounted the thrilling story of the Great Depression era, and even law enforcement officers carried the tale as a lesson in both caution and notoriety. Yet for those who met George Barnes personally, the contrast between myth and reality was stark. He had been a restless boy from Memphis, drawn to adventure and excitement, manipulated and molded into legend by circumstance, ambition, and one relentless woman. George died in 1954, decades after his imprisonment, in relative obscurity compared to the firestorm of his youth. He left no empire, no organized criminal network, no lasting violence. What endured was the image, a name, a story, a myth of a machine gun-wielding outlaw that terrified a nation. Kathryn died years later, remembered for her audacity and cunning, but also for shaping a legend that had outlived both of them. The story of Machine Gun Kelly is, at its core, a story about perception. America feared him not for what he had done alone, but for the persona created around him, the combination of ambition, media, and myth-making. He was never the unstoppable force the headlines made him, yet he became a symbol of a dangerous era. He became the embodiment of how fear, reputation, and storytelling can elevate a man beyond reality, transforming a restless, ordinary individual into a figure immortalized in American criminal history. In the end, Machine Gun Kelly was more legend than man. Fear, fame, and myth had built him into a story that would be told long after his death. But those who looked closer could see the truth. A man shaped by circumstance, manipulated by ambition, and trapped by the persona he never fully controlled. The machine gun, the daring crimes, the terrifying image. These belonged more to America's imagination than to George Barnes himself. And so, the story closes not with the roar of a gun, nor the chaos of a daring escape, but with the quiet understanding that history often mistakes image for reality, and that sometimes the most feared figures are not as fearsome as the world believes.